Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Uninvited Guest. It was supposed to be a getaway, a weekend retreat to reset and get away from the stress of city life. Clara and Ethan have been planning this for months. They found the perfect spot, a charming, isolated Airbnb in a peaceful town about 3 hours away from their home. No other guests, no noisy traffic, just nature, quiet streets, and the kind of fresh air you can only find in small towns far from the city's grasp. The listing had a cozy, inviting feel, with photos of an old Victorian house that was tucked away on the outskirts of town. There were plenty of positive reviews, with guests raving about how lovely the host was and how peaceful the atmosphere was. Clara, with her passion for all things rustic, was drawn to the place instantly. Ethan, the more cautious one, was a bit skeptical about the location, so far out, away from everything, but he trusted her judgment. So, after much back and forth, they booked the weekend. They arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the house as they pulled into the driveway. The house was exactly as the pictures promised, beautiful, old, and shrouded in a certain air of mystery. The porch creaked underfoot, and the front door, which was painted a fading shade of green, opened with a low, groaning sound. Clara laughed at how authentically creepy it felt, but Ethan wasn't laughing. His eyes flicked to the darkening woods at the back of the property. There was something unnerving about it all. But Clara pushed the feeling aside. After all, they were here to relax. Inside, the house was warm, filled with old furniture and knickknacks that gave it a lived-in feel. The host, a kind older woman named Mrs. Holloway, greeted them with a smile. She didn't stay long, offering them a quick tour and some instructions on how to use the fireplace and Wi-Fi before leaving them to their own devices. The couple unpacked, settled in, and cooked dinner. The evening was everything they had hoped for: a crackling fire, a bottle of wine, and hours spent curled up together on the couch, chatting about everything and nothing. By the time they went to bed, the world outside had faded away, and they fell asleep to the sound of wind rustling the trees and the soft tick of an old clock in the hallway. But that second night, something shifted. At first, it was subtle. Ethan woke in the middle of the night, his sleep disrupted by the faint sound of something shifting in the hallway outside their door. It wasn't the house settling. This was different, too deliberate, too soft, like the padding of someone's feet on the hardwood floors. He sat up in bed, heart pounding in his chest, but the sound stopped. He lay back down, convinced he was imagining things, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Clara was still fast asleep, her breathing slow and steady, so he let it go. But when he woke the next morning, something was wrong. It wasn't the eerie quiet of the house, or the strange shadows stretching across the walls. No, it was something far more ordinary, yet unsettling. Hanging in the hallway outside their bedroom door was a jacket, a heavy, dark coat, seemingly out of place in the summer heat. It wasn't theirs. Clara was the first to notice it, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the unfamiliar garment. "Did you leave that there?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Ethan blinked, rubbing his eyes, and shook his head. No, I didn't. That wasn't here last night. The jacket was clearly not Mrs. Holloway's, and neither of them had seen it before. But it wasn't an old, worn-out jacket. No, it was perfectly clean, well kept, and smelled faintly of pine and something else, something vaguely metallic. A chill ran down Clara's spine. She nudged Ethan, and they both made their way down the stairs to check the rest of the house. But it was silent, just as it had been the night before. The place felt too quiet, too empty, the kind of quiet where things didn't belong. They searched the rooms, looked around the house, but there was no sign of anyone else. Still, the jacket hung there, as if waiting for them to notice it. Later, they mentioned it to Mrs. Holloway when she arrived, explaining their confusion. Her face remained calm, almost too calm. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," she said with a forced smile. "No one else has stayed here in quite some time. Perhaps it's just something left behind by another guest." She didn't seem bothered by the idea at all. "But I'll check the records, just in case. I don't know who else could have been here, though." Something about her demeanor seemed off. It wasn't the friendly tone of someone eager to help. It was more detached, almost too rehearsed. Clara and Ethan exchanged uneasy glances, but they let it go. They decided it was best to brush it off, enjoy the rest of their stay, and maybe just not think about it. But that night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps were louder. Ethan woke to the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate steps. Someone walking up and down the hall outside their bedroom door. The floorboards creaked with each step. His heart raced. This wasn't his imagination. Someone was there. Someone was watching them. He got up, his body tense, but when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. The jacket was gone, but something else had replaced it, a note. It was simple, handwritten in a jagged scrawl that didn't look like Mrs. Holloway's handwriting. The note read, "You're not alone. Leave now." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Clara, who had just woken up, her face pale. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice shaking. They didn't waste any time after that. They packed their things quickly, their nerves strung tight. They left the house before dawn, with no word from Mrs. Holloway. It wasn't until the next day, as they drove back to the city, that Clara checked the Airbnb listing on her phone. The listing had been deleted. There was no trace of the place, no record of their stay, no sign of Mrs. Holloway or the house. It was as if the property had vanished from the face of the earth. They never spoke about it again, but neither of them ever forgot the chill of that jacket hanging in the hallway, or the sound of footsteps that weren't supposed to be there. And somewhere, far off, in the shadows of that lonely house, there was something waiting, something that never left. Story 2. The Hidden Room. Samantha had always been a wanderer, a solo traveler who preferred the quiet corners of the world, away from the bustle of busy tourist spots. When she found a listing for a charming Victorian-style Airbnb in the heart of a quiet, historic district, it felt like fate had brought her there. The photos were inviting: vintage furniture, ornate wallpaper, and the soft, dim lighting that seemed to capture the essence of old-world charm. The owner's reviews were glowing, and there was something about the place that spoke to her, a serene escape from the chaos of city life. It wasn't the kind of house that shouted luxury. Instead, It whispered stories of the past. The house itself was nestled in a narrow, tree-lined street where the houses stood close together, almost as if they were in quiet conversation. The kind of street where the houses leaned into one another like old friends, where every brick and shingle seemed to have its own story to tell. When Samantha arrived, it felt like stepping back in time. The front door creaked as she opened it, the scent of aged wood and mothballs drifting toward her. The furniture was antique, worn in places, but meticulously arranged. A thick rug lay on the hardwood floor of the living room, and the walls were covered in floral wallpaper that had started to peel at the edges, giving the space an almost haunted feel. But it was the kind of haunted that made you feel welcome, as though the spirits of the past weren't here to harm you, just to observe. The first night passed without incident. Samantha had spent the day exploring the quiet streets, taking in the history of the district. She returned to the house as the sun began to set, the sky painting itself in shades of amber and lavender. After a simple dinner, she settled into bed, listening to the wind rustle the leaves outside. The house seemed to breathe with her, the faint creaks of old wood punctuating the silence. It was a peaceful, almost nostalgic kind of silence, one that reminded her of childhood nights spent in her grandparents' house. But on the second night, things changed. It started with a small creak, no louder than the sound of a chair leg scraping against the floor. Samantha shifted in her bed, her eyes fluttering open to the dark room. For a moment, she thought it was just the house settling, the way old houses do in the middle of the night. She closed her eyes again, willing herself back to sleep. But the creak came again, louder this time, followed by another, and then another. The floorboards beneath her seemed to groan, as if they were protesting the weight of the night. Curiosity got the best of her. She slid out of bed, the cool air of the room brushing against her skin as she crossed to the source of the noise. It came from beneath the rug in the center of the room. The edges of the rug had started to curl up, revealing something strange underneath. At first, Samantha thought it was just an old stain or a flaw in the floorboards. But as she pulled the rug back, her breath caught in her throat. A trapdoor. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed it when she first arrived. How had she missed it? It was small, barely big enough for a person to crawl through, but it was definitely there. The wood was weathered and dark, with an intricate carving of vines that seemed to twist and writhe under her fingertips. She hesitated, unsure of what she might find, but her curiosity, that insatiable need to know, urged her to open it. With a sharp tug, she pulled the latch open. The door creaked in protest, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness below. Cold air rushed up from the depths, carrying with it the faint, musty smell of damp earth and decay. Samantha stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the blackness. She could feel something, some presence, calling her down. A whisper in the back of her mind, a voice she couldn't place, but knew she had to follow. Taking a deep breath, she descended. The stairs were narrow and steep, creaking under her weight with every step. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the house, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a small room, no more than 10 feet across. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the edges curling and flaking away. The room was empty, save for one thing: a rusted chair sitting in the center of the room, its legs warped and twisted with age. The chair looked out of place, its metal frame a stark contrast to the rest of the room's decay. But what made her skin crawl were the paintings on the walls. They were strange, disturbing even. The subjects were all distorted, their faces twisted into unnatural shapes. Eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Mouths that were stretched into wide, gaping smiles. Some were painted in oil, others in charcoal, but all were unsettling in their intensity. The figures in the paintings seemed to stare out at her from the past, as if they were trapped in this forgotten space, their souls bound to the walls. Samantha's breath quickened. The room felt alive, as though it was waiting for something. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing just inches from the chair. The floorboards groaned beneath her. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. She spun around, heart racing in her chest. Her hands scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled, pushed, but the door was sealed tight, as though something or someone on the other side was holding it closed. She pounded on the door, calling out for help, but the house swallowed her screams. Her mind raced. How had this room even existed? How had she not noticed it? And why was it hidden away, locked beneath the floorboards? Her legs began to shake, and she could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent lurking in the shadows, watching her, waiting. She turned back to the paintings, their eyes now seeming to glow in the dark. That's when she realized the truth. The room wasn't just hidden, it was meant to be forgotten. It was a secret, a part of the house that had been buried deep beneath the floorboards for a reason. And whatever had lived in this house before her had left something behind, something that was still here. After what felt like hours, the door finally creaked open. Samantha stumbled back into the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. She fled the house, the night air cold against her skin, as she made her way to the nearest hotel. She checked out early, not bothering to call the host. When she handed over the keys, the host gave her a strange, knowing smile. "Oh, you found it, didn't you?" the host said, their voice low and almost amused. "That room's been there for years. We like to leave it as a little decoration for our guests." Samantha's skin crawled as she backed away, her mind still reeling from the horrors she had uncovered. The house had been hiding more than just history. It had been hiding its own dark secrets. And Samantha would never forget the haunting presence that lingered in that forgotten room, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler. Story 3. The Phantom Host. David Mitchell was no stranger to travel. His job as a freelance consultant kept him constantly on the move, hopping between cities, staying in hotels, Airbnbs, and anywhere else that could offer him a decent bed and a working Wi-Fi connection. His latest trip brought him to a bustling city, a place he had never visited before, a city that seemed to hum with the pulse of 1,000,000 people, each of them racing towards something. It was the kind of city that, if you weren't paying attention, could swallow you whole without a second thought. He had booked the apartment through Airbnb, as usual. The host, a man named Nathan Pierce, had impeccable reviews. People called the place clean, cozy, and conveniently located, and the host himself was described as responsive and welcoming. David didn't need much more than that. The apartment seemed perfect for his 2-week stay, a little studio near the heart of the city with all the essentials. The price was right, and the listing had all the amenities he could ask for: a queen-size bed, a small kitchenette, and even a cozy reading nook by the window. David arrived at the apartment building after a long flight and a frustrating taxi ride through the dense city traffic. He pulled his suitcase behind him, his eyes already tired from the glare of neon signs and the bustle of pedestrians. When he reached the door to the apartment, there was no welcome note, no greeting from the host, no one waiting to show him around. The lockbox was waiting for him, just like the instructions said it would be. He typed in the code and let himself in. The apartment was spotless, unnervingly so. The hardwood floors gleamed under the warm light from the lamps. The couch was perfectly fluffed, and the bed was made with military precision, not a wrinkle in sight. Even the bathroom looked as though it had been recently scrubbed with a level of care that seemed out of place for an Airbnb. David couldn't shake the feeling that everything in the apartment was too perfect, like it had been staged for a photo shoot. The air smelled fresh, almost too fresh, like the kind of cleanliness that could be purchased in a can. Still, he dismissed the thought. It was just his overactive imagination. He'd been traveling for hours, and all he really wanted was to unpack, get some food, and unwind. The kitchen was small, but functional, and he immediately set to work boiling some water for coffee. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel as though the world outside was a distant memory. That was when he first heard it. At first, it was nothing more than a soft, rustling sound, like paper being shuffled in the next room. David glanced around, confused. The apartment was empty, so he brushed it off as the sound of the old building settling. But then the whispers began, so faint that he could barely make them out. Low murmurs, too soft to understand, yet unmistakable. They seemed to come from the kitchen. He walked toward it slowly, his heart beginning to race. But when he pushed open the door, there was no one there, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator. David shook his head, scolding himself for letting his mind run wild. He wasn't here to solve mysteries. He was here to work. He decided to sit down at the small dining table and start reviewing the files on his laptop. But as he worked, the whispers persisted. It was almost as if they were moving, circling him, following him from room to room. He tried to focus. He really did. But then came the footsteps. Heavy, dragging steps. Slow, deliberate. They seemed to come from just outside the door to the apartment. David froze. His blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, closer. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His first instinct was to open the door, to ask the person outside if they needed something, but he hesitated. No one had knocked. No one had called. The footsteps simply appeared. David backed away from the door, his heart pounding. His mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Was it someone else in the building? A neighbor? Maybe a late-night jogger outside? But the more he tried to rationalize it, the more the sensation of being watched grew stronger. His instinct screamed that something was very wrong, but his rational side told him it was all in his head. As the night wore on, David tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The whispers never stopped. They had grown clearer now, almost like they were speaking directly to him. The words, though indecipherable, carried a weight, as though they were meant to unnerve him, to make him question everything he thought he knew about reality. The footsteps outside his door were relentless, an ominous reminder that whatever was happening wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something or someone was there, waiting. And then he saw it. David had gotten up to use the bathroom. When he passed the living room, he glanced at the mirror hanging on the wall, a large, ornate frame that was out of place with the otherwise modern decor. At first, he didn't think anything of it. But then, as he looked at his reflection, his stomach dropped. His face, his own face, was gone. It was like he wasn't there at all. His reflection had vanished. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Nothing. Just the empty space where his face should have been. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind raced. Was this some sort of optical illusion? Was he hallucinating? But no matter how hard he tried to look, his reflection was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had never existed in that moment at all. He bolted out of the apartment, barely pausing to grab his things. His mind was spinning. He needed to get out, needed to leave. He fumbled with the lockbox and managed to close the door behind him. But as he stepped out into the hall, the whispers grew louder. The footsteps began again, this time directly behind him. David didn't turn around. He just ran. The next morning, David checked out early. He didn't care about the refund, didn't care about anything. He just needed to leave. When he went to look for the host profile to message him about his stay, something strange happened. The profile had disappeared. It wasn't just a listing. Nathan Pierce, the host, had vanished. No trace of him, no contact information, just a dead link. There was no record of him having ever existed. Confused and disturbed, David asked the building management about the apartment. The manager, a middle-aged woman with weary eyes, looked at him with a strange expression when he mentioned Nathan Pierce. "There's no one by that name," she said. "That apartment has been vacant for months, and the last tenant, well, they left pretty abruptly too." David felt a chill crawl down his spine. The apartment wasn't just empty. It was haunted by something far worse than ghosts. It was a place where reality itself had been twisted, where a phantom host had once existed, or perhaps never had. The whispers lingered with him long after he left the city, following him in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the place he couldn't escape, the place where the host had vanished.